Founder Suge Knight had a lot to say about the Tupac Shakur murder trial during a jailhouse interview with TMZ. Knight was in the car with Tupac the night he was shot on the Strip in September of 1996.
He drove the car that carried Tupac Shakur through his final 6 seconds of freedom. He caught bone fragments from that gunfire in his own scalp. And for 30 years, he said almost nothing. Now, with the jury finally seated in a Las Vegas courtroom and testimony already underway, the man who knows the most about what happened that night has broken his silence, not to help convict anyone, but to send a warning. What Suge Knight said this month didn't sound like a witness preparing to testify. It sounded like a man drawing a line in the sand and daring anyone to cross it. Marion Suge Knight is 61 years old. He is serving a 28-year sentence at a California correctional facility for a 2015 hit-and-run that killed a man named Terry Carter in a Compton parking lot. Barring something extraordinary, Knight will not walk out of prison a free man until he is deep into his 80s. He has nothing to gain by talking. He has, by his own account, everything to lose. And yet, in the run-up to the only criminal trial ever connected to Tupac Shakur's death, Knight picked up a phone and gave an interview that rippled straight into the courtroom where jury selection was just getting underway. His message, in essence, was this: this trial is not about him, and if anyone tries to drag him into it, there will be consequences for whoever does the dragging. It's a strange thing to hear from a man who is legally exposed to being subpoenaed. If prosecutors in the case against Dwayne "Kef D. Davis want Knight in that witness chair, they can compel him to show up. What they cannot compel is for him to say anything useful once he's there, and everyone connected to this case understands that distinction better than almost anyone in the country. To understand why Knight's words carry the weight they do, you have to understand exactly what he witnessed. He was behind the wheel of the black BMW that night. He was inches away when gunfire tore through the passenger side of the car. He watched Tupac take multiple rounds. He kept driving on blown tires, trying to get his friend to help, while the man next to him was dying. For 3 decades, through police interviews, a grand jury process, documentaries, and now an actual murder trial, Knight has given investigators essentially nothing. Not because his memory has failed him. By his own explanation, it's because he considers testifying against someone to be a deeper betrayal than violence itself. In his view, pointing a finger from a witness stand doesn't just end a person's freedom. In his mind, it destroys them over and over every time the story gets retold. Whether you find that logic compelling or repugnant, it's the code Knight has lived by since long before that night in Las Vegas, and it's a code that has outlasted 3 decades of pressure to break it. But there's a difference between Knight's silence about the actual shooter and his willingness to talk about everything that surrounded it. And in his recent interview, he kept steering the conversation toward a name that has trailed this case since 1996. To get there, you have to go back to the night itself. September 7, 1996, was supposed to be one of the biggest celebrations Las Vegas had seen in years. Mike Tyson was fighting Bruce Seldon at the MGM Grand, and the fight drew a crowd that blended the worlds of boxing, hip-hop, and the street culture both scenes were tangled up in. Tupac and Suge Knight had ringside seats. Tyson knocked Seldon out in the first round, and the MGM Grand lobby turned into a sea of thousands of people trying to process what they just watched. That's when things went sideways. A death row associate spotted a young man named Orlando Anderson in the crowd, a member of the Southside Compton Crips. Months earlier, Anderson and a group of Crips had jumped a death row associate and taken his chain, a death row medallion, which in that world wasn't just jewelry, it was a message. Stealing it wasn't a robbery, so much as a provocation aimed squarely at death row records. When Anderson was pointed out in the MGM lobby, Tupac moved on him immediately, and Knight and others joined in. Security cameras caught the entire assault, and that footage would end up playing on news broadcasts for weeks. What gets lost in the retelling is what that beating meant for Tupac personally. He'd only been out of prison since late 1995, released on bail that Knight posted while Tupac appealed a sexual assault conviction he always denied. Getting caught on camera assaulting someone in a casino lobby was a real threat to his freedom, a parole violation waiting to happen. According to Knight's own later accounts, Tupac left that fight rattled, worried the footage would send him back to prison, and determined that he wasn't going back under any circumstances. He changed out of his fight clothes back at the Luxor and climbed into Knight's BMW for the short drive to Club 662, a venue Knight owned, where Tupac was due to make an appearance. A convoy of Death Row-affiliated vehicles trailed behind them. For a few minutes, with Tupac hanging out of the sunroof and fans jogging alongside the car, the night felt like it had moved past the chaos at the MGM. Then a white Cadillac pulled alongside the BMW at a red light near East Flamingo Road and Koval Lane. What happened in the next several seconds changed the trajectory of hip-hop history. Shots were fired into the passenger side of the car. Tupac was hit multiple times. Knight, despite catching shrapnel himself, made a U-turn and tried to get help. Tupac died 6 days later in the hospital. He was 25. The men in that Cadillac didn't arrive at that intersection by accident, and figuring out exactly how they got there, who planned it, who paid for it, who pulled the trigger, is the mystery that has consumed true crime obsessives, journalists, and law enforcement for 30 years. For most of that time, the case looked permanently unsolvable. There was no murder weapon recovered. The Cadillac itself was never found. Orlando Anderson, the man widely suspected of being the shooter, was killed in an unrelated gang shooting in Compton less than 2 years later, at age 23, taking whatever he knew to the grave. By most measures, this should have stayed a cold case forever. It didn't because of one man's decision to keep talking about it in public for 2 straight decades. Dwayne Kef D. Davis, Anderson's uncle and a former high-ranking figure in the South Side Compton Crips, gave interviews to multiple television networks over the years. He appeared in a docuseries in 2018 and described On Camera, where the fatal shots came from inside that Cadillac. Then in 2019, he published a memoir titled Compton Street Legend, marketed explicitly around his position as the last living eyewitness to the murder. In it, he laid out how he says he obtained the gun used that night, described riding in a Cadillac, and detailed what he was wearing. Details investigators later say lined up with photographic evidence. In September 2023, Las Vegas police arrested Davis at his home in Henderson, Nevada, where by his own description, he had been living a quiet retirement, playing golf, spending time with grandchildren, convinced his past was behind him. Davis had reportedly given some of those earlier statements as part of a proffer agreement connected to a separate federal investigation into the murder of Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G., an agreement Nevada prosecutors argued never protected him from state charges. A judge agreed, and Davis was indicted on 1 count of murder with a deadly weapon, with a gang enhancement, in connection with Tupac's death. He has pleaded not guilty and has remained in custody since his arrest. Davis's defense strategy has been, by most legal observers' accounts, an uphill climb. His attorneys have argued that Compton Street Legend was largely fiction shaped by a co-writer, and that Davis never even read the finished book. But prosecutors uncovered a recorded jailhouse call Davis made shortly after his 2023 arrest, in which he was asked about the memoir and reportedly confirmed, in a handful of words, that he had. That call, along with the book itself, became central pieces of evidence. Clark County District Judge Carly Kearney ultimately ruled the memoir admissible, finding that Davis had spent years promoting it as an accurate account rather than a work of fiction. That brings us to where things actually stand right now, because this is no longer a story about a trial that's coming. It's a story about one that started. Jury selection began the week of August 10, 2026, and by August 13th, a panel of 12 jurors and 4 alternates had been seated after days of questioning more than 100 prospective jurors about their exposure to the case, their views on gangs, and their familiarity with Tupac's music. Opening statements followed, and testimony is now underway in a Las Vegas courtroom. 30 years almost to the day since Tupac was shot. Prosecutors have been clear from the outset that they are not claiming Davis pulled the trigger. Their theory is that he orchestrated the shooting and supplied the weapon, acting as what one prosecutor once described as the on-the-ground commander who set the retaliation in motion. Early witness testimony has included law enforcement figures who worked the original investigation, including questions about whether leads connecting to the unsolved Biggie Smalls case were ever fully run down. The trial is expected to run for roughly a month, and legal analysts covering it have been careful to note something important. Even a conviction here likely won't answer who actually fired the shots that killed Tupac. That question may never be resolved in a courtroom. Which brings the story back to Suge Knight, because his refusal to cooperate isn't a footnote to this trial. For prosecutors, it's one of the central obstacles. There is no recovered murder weapon. There is no recovered Cadillac. The man believed to be the shooter has been dead for decades. And the only living person who sat 2 feet from Tupac when the bullets came through that window has spent 30 years making it clear he will not help build the case, no matter who asks. Knight's silence about the shooting itself is deliberate, and he's been consistent about why. But his silence doesn't extend to everyone connected to this story. In his interviews from prison, Knight has repeatedly circled back to one name that surfaces again and again in the paperwork around this case, a name that appeared dozens of times in Clark County prosecutors' 2024 court filings: Sean Diddy Combs. The allegation traces back to Davis's own 2008 proffer session with federal investigators. According to reporting on documents obtained by USA Today, Davis told investigators that Combs had offered a substantial bounty, reportedly around $1 million, for the deaths of both Tupac and Knight, and that Combs allegedly made comments to that effect in front of dozens of people. It's important to be precise about what this is and isn't. It is an allegation made by a man with his own credibility problems and his own legal incentives, and it has never resulted in charges. Las Vegas police have publicly stated that Combs has never been treated as a suspect in Tupac's murder. Combs, for his part, has consistently and firmly denied any involvement. None of that has stopped the allegation from following Combs for years, and Knight has been one of its loudest amplifiers, both in television interviews and podcast appearances, repeatedly suggesting there's more to uncover about where certain money trails led after the shooting. Other figures connected to Combs's inner circle over the years have made public statements urging investigators to trace the alleged payment further. None of these claims have been proven in court, and it's worth being direct about that. An allegation repeated often is still an allegation, not a verdict.